This recording will cover Chapter 2 in your textbook, and it's just called Adolescents with Disabilities, which is what this whole semester is about, right? So let's look at some the impact of the passage of IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Hopefully you have heard about this act before in earlier classes of yours or, in your own jobs where you are now. This increased the number of students receiving special ed services, but it also, or not but, it also increased the number of students with disabilities in gen ed classrooms, okay, which is kind of what we want to talk about. And it also increased funding. So all of those are good things, right, for our students with disabilities. Back in the day, way back in the day, secondary schools were originally only for boys. So girls never got to go to secondary, high school or post-secondary. It was only for boys. And by about 1920, most included grades 9 through 12, and I believe included more girls allowed to go to those classes, or to those schools, excuse me, as well. Some principles of secondary education. They came out in 1918, so I am not too familiar with them. This was, before I was born. But so here are some principles of secondary education, just to kind of have those in the back of your mind. And especially for our students with disabilities, we really want to think about vocations for these students, jobs, right? And also worthy use of their leisure time, right? Especially for some of your students with maybe autism or something like that. How do they spend their free time? Typically, they spend it alone, right, and playing video games. Well, that's really, that's not fair to them. So we want to think about all of these things as you are working with this population. So comprehensive high schools continues to be the predominant and the most common model. In theory, it provides a wide range of opportunities to all students, but does that really mean all students, right? We want to make sure that our students with disabilities are getting the same range of opportunities that our students without disabilities are getting as well. No Child Left Behind, Nation at Risk, you may have heard of these, you may not have. No Child Left Behind was really all the rage for a while. It pushed for more assessment for all students, including students with disabilities. So think about some of your, your students with autism who might be nonverbal. Do they really need to take more standardized assessments? My opinion is no. However, nobody ever asked for my opinion, but I like to share it anyway. Okay, so some challenges for secondary schools. They really are just kind of, what's the word, like a microcosm of society in general, right? So there's substance abuse problems, there's violence, there's dropout rates, there's limited parental involvement, and also increased accountability for the schools. I was actually just listening to a podcast on my way here to the office. It was a Dateline edition, and it was called Young, what was it called? Young Lords of Chaos or something like that. And it was about this like 15-year-old student who like gathered all his friends. He was like bullied, but then he became, he gathered his friends with him and they ended up killing a teacher. And then he was trying to commit this whole like revenge killing thing. 15 years old. You know where he got the guns from? His mom. So, whether that's right or wrong, that's not my point. But my point is, that was a student, he wasn't diagnosed with any type of disability, according to the podcast. But these are the challenges we're seeing in secondary schools. So, again, thinking about the substance abuse, of violence, stuff like that, that we're seeing in society, we're seeing that in secondary schools as well. Dropout is also a problem, right? There's, a high dropout rate. The majority of dropouts are unemployed. Dropouts earn significantly less than high school completers. And they're, of course, they can go back and get their GEDs, all that kind of stuff. And it leads to social alienation. Guess who's prone to dropping out? Students with disabilities, right? Especially our students with emotional and behavioral disabilities or really significant learning disabilities. Those are students who are really prone to dropping out. And then what's going to happen? Oh, they're going to circle back to substance abuse, violence, stuff like this. And it just becomes this cycle that, it's hard for individuals to get out of. Okay, so Some factors to address to impact the dropout rates. Well, guess what? Some of them we can't do anything about, right? Staffing issues, we can't do anything about that. Administrative issues, we can't do anything about that. Student characteristics and school demographics, we really can't do anything about that, right? It is what it is. Wherever you teach, you're going to have students who have, X, Y, and Z characteristics. You're going to have the school that has this kind of demographics. But what you all can do something about is the classroom environment and instructional strategies. So that's really what this class is going to focus on, and how you can create a positive and a welcoming and an engaging classroom environment, and also some strategies that will help with that engagement and that active involvement and that active participation, right? So again, we can't really control some of these things. We can't help it if a school is 10 teachers short. We can't do anything about that. But again, what you can do something about is the classroom environment and the instructional strategies. Okay, so that's really where we're going to get in depth in the next over the next couple of chapters. So, teaching in secondary schools. A lot of you probably know this. I know some of you are in secondary schools now. Most teachers tend to focus on a specific content area, and doesn't necessarily those content, or those teachers, I should say, don't necessarily have the time and or the training, unless you're special ed teachers, right, to focus on those developmental needs. And there tends to be a negative impact on many students with disabilities in the secondary schools. Again, just because a social studies teacher, let's say, isn't necessarily going to have the training or the, I don't want to say skills, but maybe the knowledge to appropriately work with students with disabilities, right? They didn't go to school for special ed, right? You all are in school for special ed, and I'm kind of quoting that, but you are. So, but many of your other of your colleagues at secondary schools, they went to focus on social studies or science or math or ELA or computers or home ec, but I don't think that's what it's called anymore, but I don't know the new term, right? So we want to limit as much as we can this negative impact on the students with disabilities in the secondary schools. Okay, so special education in secondary schools, services in secondary has really only taken place, special ed services, since the 1980s, which isn't really that long ago, right? If you think about it, in the past, students who, when they got to high school age, they just weren't allowed to come to school anymore, or they were sent to a separate and a segregated school, right? Because our elementary students were focused on first, which is all fine and well and good. But then a lot of the older students ended up dropping out of school. And that goes back to what we said on, slide 1 or slide 2. Then that leads to lower income, social alienation. It could lead to violence. It could lead to substance abuse, all of those things. So when services expanded, when special education services expanded, the number of students with disabilities in secondary schools really grew dramatically, which is good, right? It's what we want to see. But we just have to make sure we find kind of the best model that works for these students at the secondary level. So we have the typical models are self-contained special ed class, resource room, inclusive educational model. And sorry, I should have paused a little more. Each model definitely has its strengths and weaknesses. Those of you who are in a secondary school now, not for your placement, because that hasn't happened yet, but for your job, think about what models you may have seen or you may see at your school, and think about the strengths and weaknesses of each one. So the inclusion model, this is pretty typical for secondary students, right? So about 44% of secondary students are included at least 80% of the school day in gen ed, right? So inclusion of students in secondary general classes continues to be the trend. Why do you think that might be? Well, it might be to not segregate the students with disabilities any more than they already have been, right? Especially at this age, students know when they are being segregated, or the other students know, oh, that student goes to special ed, even though special ed should not be thought of as a place, but that's neither here nor there. So most students with disabilities are included in secondary classes to some degree. Is it always appropriate for them? Well, maybe, maybe not. If their reading at a second grade level, is sitting in an 11th grade social studies class the best use of their time? Depends on the student, right? I fully support the inclusion model when it's appropriate for students. Sometimes they need more help than a gen ed teacher knows how to provide for them. So the rationale supporting inclusion, the dual system, kind of, back when it's special ed and gen ed, kind of assumes two distinct group of students. And that people in the gen ed quote group are, they won't talk to students in the special ed group. So the inclusion hopes to kind of bridge that gap and create those opportunities for interaction with peers, provide those social and academic outcomes, and also give the access to general curriculum, if it's appropriate for that student. So most teachers do support inclusion, and most principals do as well. Teachers, kind of historically have viewed principals as supportive, and also non-disabled students are supportive of inclusion. We just have to make sure it's done right and that the proper supports are still in place for these students who might need more than just going to a gen ed social studies class, every day and not really getting the material. So again, I am fully in support of inclusion when it's done well and when it's appropriate for that particular student. Okay, we do have, remember, IDEA requires extensive services in public schools, which is good, right? Because in the past, our students were segregated. They were completely in other schools or even institutions. So IDEA brought that, hey, everyone's entitled to a free, appropriate public education, right? So you as the school and as the team for that student, you're going to have to figure out what that looks like. Remember, special Section 504 is civil rights legislation. I'm having a hard time with these words. Section 504 is not special ed legislation, it is civil rights. Okay, and then there's also the Americans with Disabilities Act is also civil rights legislation. And you can certainly look up more for that if you want to. IDEA, however you want to talk about it. We've talked about eligibility. Students get referred, then they're assessed, they're determined if they have a disability in one of the categories, then an individual education program is written. And you'll learn more about this if you're not super familiar with this process in Education 759. That's where we really dive into the IEP process. And then we want to make sure our students are served in the least restrictive environment for them. Okay, for some students, it might be the gen ed class with a special ed teacher coming in, a resource teacher coming in once or twice a week. For other students, it might be a more restrictive environment, as long as it's the least restrictive environment for them, for that student. And again, we'll talk more about this in 759. And we also want to make sure we're addressing how the students are going to transition, first of all, from, early childhood, kind of grade ages 3 to 5 to kindergarten and more school-based, and also how they're going to transition out of high school. What comes next for these students? What is after high school? Is it college? Is it a trade school? Is it going right to work? We need to think about that for these students so they're not just left flailing about when they graduate high school. Okay, 504 and the ADA, again, civil rights laws, they use broader definitions of disability. IDEA has very specific disability categories that a student must qualify for in order to receive an individual education program. 504 and ADA, they have broader categories of disability. 504 applies to entities that receive federal funds, and ADA applies to most other entities. So thinking about if you're walking on the sidewalk and there is a curb cut where it goes down flat, that is because of the ADA for our wheelchair users, right? So that's an ADA kind of requirement. Okay, so goals for adolescents with disabilities. Well, again, post-secondary education and training, whatever that might look like for that particular student. It might be vocational career, really focusing on jobs or career training. And also some of them might really need some independent living preparation. Some of our students with autism, they can live by themselves, right? But, especially if you're working in a high school, 9th, 10th, 11th grade, or I meant to say, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, you might be responsible for some of these, providing some of these transition skills, especially independent living. You might be responsible for getting your students ready to transition from high school to whatever is next for that student. And again, some issues facing secondary special education, dropping out of school, right? Increasing accountability. So they have to take some tests, but they really need to take them all. Transition needs, what's going to happen to them after high school. And guess what? We really need teachers at this grade level or at this, age. So hopefully some of you are wanting to stay or go into secondary. I told y'all I was always preschool and elementary, but I know some of you really like secondary, which is Great. Recruit some friends. Tell them to come to secondary. And just really quickly, the roles of teachers. Gen Ed teachers really need to learn how to differentiate instruction. They really need to figure that out. Special education teachers must provide academic supports, which hopefully you'll learn some of in this class. Teaching daily living skills, study skills, and social skills. So lots of roles and responsibilities for our teachers. All right, this concludes chapter 2. I will see you for chapter 3.